Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishore Narayan from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at VeggieDiplomat. Hello and welcome to episode 20 of India Rising, Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishore, a show in which we analyze the happenings from around the world and their impact on India. In today's episode, we will be discussing about the statement by the Indian Defence Minister, Shri Rajnath Singh, about how India might reconsider its self-imposed no-first-use policy depending on circumstances. But before that, we wish to take a moment and thank all our listeners for all the feedback and the genuine warmth shown. Our listener base is constantly on the rise on SoundCloud and other podcast media, and we are glad that we are able to reach out to a completely new audience in the podcast world. Our ever-increasing listenership numbers are a testimony to this. We are also receiving targeted feedback and approvals, and we are closely following each one of them. One such appreciation that came last week, specifically regarding our previous episode on the dilution of Article 370, was especially gladdening. I quote, "The podcast gives a lot of insight into the 370 issue. The first half contained an in-depth discussion about the articles. In the second half, the annexation of Gilgit-Baltistan into Pakistan in 2018 was mentioned. This was something that I never knew about. Both of them have covered or discussed the issue superbly. I need to listen to other previous episodes also." Unquote. Once again, a heartfelt thanks from both Mohal and me for all the time you have spent with us, and we will continue to strive hard to keep up the quality and content in the future too. Now, without any further ado, let's get on with today's episode. Defence Minister Rajnath Singh was in Pokhran in Rajasthan, where the nuclear tests were held, to offer tribute to Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee on his first death anniversary. He said, and I quote, "Pokhran is the area which witnessed Atalji's firm resolve to make India a nuclear power and yet remain firmly committed to the doctrine of no first use. India has strictly adhered to this doctrine. What happens in the future depends on the circumstances." This statement by the Defence Minister set the proverbial cat among the pigeons as it opened up a new debate on the no first use of nuclear weapons. Now, before we look at the nuclear doctrine and India's stated policies, let's look at how the NDA government, headed by PM Narendra Modi, since 2014, has handled the Pakistani challenge. For the past 2 decades, India lacked effective options to deter cross-border terrorists protected by Pakistan's nuclear umbrella. A conventional retaliation could be threatened only after high-profile attacks, such as those on Parliament in 2001 and in Mumbai on 26/11. But because of the risk, well advertised by Pakistan, that an actual Indian retaliation could invite low-yield nuclear weapons use on Indian forces or cities, New Delhi always stopped short of war. This changed in February 2019 when PM Modi ordered a conventional retaliatory response inside Pakistani territory following an attack on a military convoy in Pulwama, something that we have covered extensively in one of our previous episodes. This set a new benchmark binding Modi and all his successors in the future to respond in a similar and stronger manner. Unlike this year, situations in the future could escalate, and the Indian armed forces might have to take the war into Pakistan, rubbing against Pakistan's nuclear red lines. This is where Rajnath Singh's statement comes in. If Pakistan were to threaten a nuclear strike, or if New Delhi were to believe that a strike was in the offing, India would strike first. The Modi government appears to have calculated that the fear of an Indian nuclear strike will raise Pakistan's costs of cross border terrorism, thus deterring its use.
So, Kishore, that was a good introduction for the listeners. So, can you please elaborate what is the Modi government security doctrine?
Yes, indeed, Mohal. So, officially, there is nothing called a security doctrine published by the government in New Delhi. The government only publishes something called as a nuclear doctrine, which we can talk about later. But the fact is that India continues to suffer from sub-conventional cross-border terror attacks by Pakistan. Pakistan also actively indulges in support to separatist elements in the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. Obviously, India's patience against such activities of Pakistan has run out and is forced to act each time in a manner bigger than the previous response. A conventional retaliation could be threatened only after high profile attacks, as I mentioned, such as those against the parliament in 2011 and in Mumbai on 26/11. But then, because of the risk that an actual Indian retaliation could invite a low yield nuclear weapon use on Indian forces or cities, New Delhi always stopped short of war. Now, all this changed in 2019, as I told. So, again, this is where things stand as of now. And India has actually upped the ante when it comes to conventional retaliatory response. Mohal. So, with that as a security strategy for the government, can you kind of differentiate between India's nuclear doctrine and the Pakistani nuclear doctrine to our listeners?
Yeah, so India's nuclear doctrine was initially drafted by then the National Security Advisory Board in 1999, shortly after we went overtly nuclear in 1998. Uh, this was updated and officially published finally on, I think, Jan 4th, 2003. So the doctrine broadly touches upon the following main concepts of what is called a CMD, credible minimum deterrence, NFU, which is the no first use and which has been in the news lately with Rajnath Singh's comments, and massive retaliation. So let's go one by one for the benefit of listeners, like what does all three of them entail. So CMD is what is referred as credible minimum deterrence. So this refers to having a minimum stockpile of nuclear weapons which is credible in the eyes of the adversary and which does take the threat from India's nuclear weapons seriously. So see, unlike the Cold War, where both USA and the USSR had thousands, like some reports up to 65,000 nuclear weapons at their disposal to annihilate each other. But like in India's case, we are looking at the minimum stockpile which is seen credible in the eyes of the enemy. The next one is NFU, which is like no first use. So out of the 9 so-called countries which have nuclear weapons, only 2 of them, China and India, have a official declared policy of no first use for nuclear weapons, which means that conventional attacks won't be responded to with nuclear weapons. They're only to deter nuclear attacks and will be used only if the adversary used nuclear weapons before them. Uh, the last one is what is called as massive retaliation, which means that if Pakistan, or let's say an adversary, uses any kind of nuclear attack on us, it will be responded to with maximum force. Now, as Brigadier Gumit Kanwal, like who has written extensively on nuclear matters and armed forces issues, wrote recently that with a pacifist strategic culture steeped in Gandhian non-violence, India is a reluctant nuclear power. He adds, saying that Indians have tended to believe that nuclear weapons are political weapons and not weapons of war fighting, and their sole purpose is to deter the use and the threat of nuclear weapons. India's nuclear doctrine is built around credible minimum deterrence and professes a no use posture. So that is broadly encapsulates the Indian nuclear doctrine, which relies on credible minimum deterrence, no first use, and massive retaliation. I'll go a bit more into the massive retaliation later in the podcast.
Mhm.
So on the other hand, Pakistan, earlier they used to espouse what they called a strategic deterrence. That is, Pakistan will use nuclear weapons to protect itself against the conventional superiority of the Indian forces. I mean, in many of the earlier wars, like the 65 and especially the 71 war, what they have realized that the brute force of the Indian conventional cannot be overcome easily. So especially after the 71 war, I mean, they started working on their nuclear program to level sort of the playing field in their mind between the two countries. So however, since they have shifted to their policy which is called to full spectrum deterrence, to understand that what that means, we'll step back, take a small step back in history. So in the 2002, during Operation Parakram, India mobilized thousands of troops after attacks on Indian parliament. However, this exercise took many weeks, which allowed Pakistan to counter mobilize to thwart any thrust by Indian armed forces or armored columns across the border. Now, one of the lessons learned on the Indian side from Op Parakram was that India needed to mobilize its troops and formations quicker to make shallow thrusts into Pakistan in case of war breaking out. Now, Pakistan, which as a result had to make some shifts in its own doctrine. So they shifted their doctrine from what they refer to as strategic deterrence to now what they call as full spectrum deterrence. So now Pakistan has indicated its willingness to deploy what they call as tactical nuclear weapons. These are very low yield weapons, which they have professed to fit on the short range Nasser missiles, which they can launch on advancing Indian columns of armored vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and even soldiers when they cross their so-called red lines while on Pakistani soil. So Pakistani has like sort of a first use policy, is basically more about a projection which they where they espouse a very low threshold for using tactical weapons, unlike the Indian approach where we have professed a no first use policy, where we'll only use nuclear weapons in when attacked with nuclear weapons. So now this has been done deliberately by Pakistan to discourage any conventional attack by India, while they continue to push sub-conventional attacks against India via non-state actors like the various militant groups. So Kishore, the statement by Rajnath Singh, is this the first time that there have been statements on revising the no first use policy?
Uh, in fact, this is the first time that it is coming out at such a high level. But then let's take a few steps back and try to figure out if such noises had been made earlier. So in November 2016, speaking at the launch of Gurmeet Kanwal, Brigadier Gurmeet Kanwal, whom you referred to earlier, speaking at the launch of his book on national security, The New Arthashastra, ex-defense minister Manohar Parrikar, he had gone back to Goa and become the chief minister by then. So he said that he did not understand why India had to be first hit before it would hit back. He said that there should be an element of unpredictability in the country's military strategy. He mentioned the advantages of unpredictability and said, I quote him here, if a written strategy exists, You are giving away your strength. Why should India bind itself to no first use? India is a responsible nuclear power and we will not use nuclear weapons irresponsibly. Unquote. As his statement made ripples back then, he later clarified that these statements were in his personal capacity and that there was no official change in India's policy. The essence of the former defense minister's introspection was that ambiguity enhanced deterrence. A little earlier than that, Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, former national security advisor, had written that India may have to resort to first use in case it had definitive information on Pakistan's intent to launch first. Also, in a speech at the National Defense College in 2010, he described India's nuclear doctrine as emphasizing minimum deterrence, no first use against non nuclear weapon states. Now, since he mentioned NFU, no first use, to just non nuclear weapon states, analysts concluded that India was retaining a first use option against nuclear adversaries, especially Pakistan and China. So, in other words, in layman's language, Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon emphasized that India would want to have a first use policy against states like Pakistan and would continue to have some kind of a minimum deterrence. So, there was no change in terms of deterrence, but only in terms of the usage, who would go first. Now, after that, in 2018, the Defense Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, the then Defense Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, in reply to a question in the parliament, said that the government was aware of the growing nuclear capability of Pakistan and is committed to take all necessary steps to safeguard national security and respond to any threat suitably. While successive governments post Vajpayee-led NDA-1 had stuck with no first use, the Narendra Modi-led BJP prior to the 2014 election in its manifesto promised to revise and update India's nuclear doctrine to make it relevant to the challenges of the current times. Many interpreted this as moving away from NFU or potentially diluting it. However, it was reported that Modi quickly denied such an intention, stating in an interview in April 2014, I quote him here, NFU was a great initiative of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. There is no compromise on that. We are very clear. NFU is a reflection of our cultural inheritance, unquote. Now, just last November, while making the announcement of the first deterrence patrol of India's ballistic missile nuclear submarine, INS Arihant, Modi again pledged commitment to NFU, saying, I quote him again here, India remains committed to the doctrine of credible minimum deterrence and no first use, as enshrined in the decision taken in 2003, in the January of 2003. Now, this is how we have been listening to conflicting signals in the past 6 to 7 years. But I think it is safe to say that the nuclear doctrine itself has not changed any bit, but just that people who at one point in time uh, uh, were in important positions like Manohar Parrikar or Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon or even the then Defense Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, they have gone ahead and made some statements or have clarified the government's position. But that apart, somehow the nuclear doctrine itself of no first use, that has not changed much. So, Mohal, uh, if you can now elaborate on how a revision of the Indian nuclear policy from no first use to first use, uh, if you can elaborate on how it would be useful, would you do that?
Yeah. So the no first use doctrine that India has says that India will not be the first ones to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. Now, this means that India would have to take a blow before it can dish out damage to the enemy in the nuclear domain. Now, this doctrine of taking punishment before India can launch nuclear weapons is not favored by some some folks who call this strategy as a loss of initiative and weak. Now, Lieutenant General B.S. Nagal, a former strategic forces commander under which the nuclear weapons come under the strategic forces command, has been consistently arguing for revocation of the no first use pledge on the grounds that it allows Pakistan to take the initiative while restricting India's options. Uh, Militarily, however, like no first use puts India in a disadvantageous position. So let me dwell deeper. But before we dwell deeper on the question of the benefits of first use versus no first use, for the benefit of listeners, I will spend a little time on uh, two aspects of nuclear targeting, which are commonly known as counter force targeting and counter value targeting. So, a
Mhm.
counter force targeting is a target where you are the objective is to hit the elements of the military infrastructure, which can be either weapons or bases that support them, while a counter value target refers to the targeting of the opponent's cities or civilian populations. So like basically if you're hitting the armed forces or the delivery systems, it's basically counter force, and if you're hitting just general population to obliterate them, which is called as counter value. Now, for a country like India, Dr. Manpreet Sethi, who is a distinguished fellow at Center of Air Power Studies in New Delhi and is an expert on nuclear affairs, has argued that NFU makes a very good strategy or policy for India. So, what no first use is basically it leaves the onus of escalation on the adversary. Here, the adversary and not India has to break the so-called taboo or threshold of using nuclear weapons, after which India can justify the response with a massive retaliation on the enemy's assets. Now, after being used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there has been a aversion to use nuclear weapons and a strong opposition worldwide. So like India won't be seen as the aggressor here by having the adversary first use nuclear weapons, so it can claim to have the moral high ground. Also, India's doctrine doesn't discriminate between strategic and tactical weapons uh, as part of the massive retaliation strategy, that which means that basically in case of any kind of use of nuclear weapons, it will invite massive retaliation. So this leaves the onus of escalation plus the moral dilemma of using nuclear weapons on the enemy, where they have lost the moral high ground, and plus any kind of even a small tactical attack on just a few armored vehicles or tanks and soldiers will invite a massive retaliation where the enemy could be finished off with a huge nuclear strike.
Even if it
So
happens on Pakistani soil.
yeah, so the policy, the nuclear policy doesn't differentiate between a nuclear attack on Indian soil versus foreign
Right.
soil.
Yeah.
So so now let's say like India moves to the first use policy, as Rajnath Singh was maybe hinting to in the future. Obviously there's no policy change in the future, but let's, like for a devil's advocate, let's see what if we do to a first use. Now in such a case, a first strike would have to be a decapitation strike, as they say, because you want to knock out all of the enemy's nuclear assets which can be used to store or launch nuclear weapons. You don't want to leave the chance that you take out half his assets, and with the other half the enemy having nothing to lose at that case would react, would do a second strike on your cities and armed forces, and would cause massive damage to you. So unless you can destroy all of their assets, you will be looking to suffer a second strike on yourself. So what you need to do is probably you need to take out all their assets in one shot. Now to do this, you will need to have excellent what they call as ISR capabilities, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to ensure that you can account for all of their nuclear assets. This capability, I mean, we are not sure that India fully possesses at the moment, and it would also require time, money, and resources, significant of them, to be invested to develop the ISR, to identify all the launch platforms and the facilities which store nuclear weapons, and to take them out in a single strike. Now, also, trying to destroy all of the enemy's nuclear assets would require a far larger inventory than what India has, which is for credible minimum deterrence or counter value targeting. So, if the for counter value targeting, maybe if you are just looking to destroy a few of the enemy cities to cause a substantial amount of damage, for targeting all the nuclear assets, you might require multiple weapons for a target, or you might, if the assets are spread out over a large geographical area, you would require a far bigger inventory of nuclear weapons than what India currently has. Also, furthermore, now no first use proposes counter value targeting, where the cities would be targeted once your enemy has used nuclear weapons on Indian or Indian forces. Now, with the size of cities in Asia, one doesn't require very large level of accuracy as a nuclear bomb. I mean, you could practically drop a nuclear bomb anywhere on a city, which will cause enormous damage due to the high population density of Indian cities. However, for counter force targeting, with the first use policy, you require a very high level of accuracy. So, not only the aforementioned points on ISR and accuracy will play a key role in taking out these assets, but even if you consider mobile assets like missile launchers, airplanes, or submarines, they are always on the move. So, unless you have very crucial information, you could be missing them. Or even if you barely miss, maybe they might get a glancing blow and they could launch against you. So you also require a very high level of targeting for the counter force strategy. Now, also remember that Pakistan is working on putting the nuclear capable the submarine launch cruise missile Babar on its submarines in the future, to have assured second strike capability. Now, since submarines are harder to detect and destroy once they're underwater, this will also make elimination of all the nuclear assets much harder. Like, even in the case that India was able to destroy all of Pakistan's land based assets in a theoretical first strike, the submarines could be hovering anywhere in the Arabian Sea and could launch their second strike response against India. So these are like some of the various points. Now, one more thing is that first use or counter force targeting, where we target all the military assets, also means that this would have to be a bolt from the blue attack, as if, because if the enemy is aware of an incoming strike, it won't be successful. As I said, the mobile assets like submarines, airplanes, and the missile launchers, like, they would obviously be moved to safer locations or more secured or hardened nuclear proof shelters to prevent them from getting attacked. So this would require the Indian nuclear forces to be on a quick trigger alert to launch anytime, because if you take too long, I mean, the enemy would detect massive movement of Indian nuclear assets and prepare for an incoming strike. So what this does is, having to be on a quick trigger alert all the time creates an additional headache of having the nuclear warheads to be constantly mated with the delivery systems. Now, usually in the nuclear domain, like, demating of warheads is done to prevent accidents, or they being launched without authorization by a rogue armed forces officer. So the warhead and the trigger or the delivery system, they're all kept separately for safety purposes. Now, granted, this risk is more likely in the case of Pakistan with the tactical nukes versus India, but it does possess a risk nonetheless. If you to create this quick trigger attacks, you have to keep all your warheads mated together all the time. Now, so to conclude, for a growing country like India, which has innumerable challenges with all kinds of developmental issues, I mean, if India switched to from a no first use and a counter value targeting to a first use and a counter force targeting, will mean that India will have to spend much more beefing up its ISR capabilities, the number of nuclear warheads, the has to fine tune the accuracy of its delivery systems, command and control authority, plus the moral dilemma which always exists that you are the guys to use nuclear weapons first in an exchange. Plus also the other possibility that I think Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon mentioned, that let's say if India had a first use policy where they think that Pakistan is preparing for their own launch, and India decides to launch, and if they find out later on the information is false, then it creates a moral dilemma that you would have launched based on bad information. So then it would put the moral dilemma back on you to have started the nuclear warfare. So there are a whole lot of um, capabilities and technological and command and control and moral issues by from switching from a no first use and counter value target sorry counter value targeting to a first use and counter force targeting. So moving on, Kishore, like what has been Pakistan's response to the statement by Rajnath Singh?
Yeah, so as expected, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi termed the Indian Defense Minister's statement as shocking and irresponsible, and he read out from a prepared statement. I quote, "The substance and timing of the Indian Defense Minister's statement is highly unfortunate and reflective of India's irresponsible and belligerent behavior. It further exposes the pretense of their no first use policy, to which we have never accorded any credence. No first use pledge is non verifiable and cannot be taken at face value, especially when development of offensive capabilities and force postures belie such claims. Pakistan has always proposed measures relating to nuclear restraint in South Asia and has eschewed measures that are offensive in nature. Pakistan will continue to maintain a credible minimum deterrence posture." Unquote. Now, although this was the official statement coming in from the foreign minister, there were a couple of issues with what he said. First, they kept telling that uh, they never accorded any credence to the India's no first use policy, which is actually true because Pakistan has always refused to acknowledge that India had a no first use policy. And beyond that, they kept pointing fingers at India's efforts to have offensive capabilities and turned the tables around and said that India was always the aggressor, although that was not the case. Now, the other part was that Shah Mahmood Qureshi pointing out that Pakistan will continue to maintain a credible minimum deterrence posture, which is again a lie, Mohal, like how you mentioned, that Pakistan has already switched over from credible minimum deterrence posture to a full spectrum response deterrence posture after Operation Parakram. So again, there were ironical and hypocritical statements coming in from Shah Mahmood Qureshi. So yeah, that was the response coming in from Pakistan. Now, Mohal, are there any other concerns of moving away from no first use policy?
Yeah, so India, since its nuclear tests in Pokhran 2 in 1998, has, as we said, like has a stated no first use policy. Now, this has allowed India to project itself as a responsible nuclear power and has allowed India to get accepted in the global nuclear order. Now, the Indian-US civil nuclear deal in 2008 owes some credit to this stance from India. Now, India is a member of most of the technology denial regimes, like as MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and the Wassenaar Arrangement. It is also pursuing full membership of Nuclear Suppliers Group. We do have a a waiver, correct, Kishore, for the
Hmm.
NSG, but we
That's
don't have
right.
full
Yeah.
membership. Now, moving away from the NFU could possibly harm India's nuclear image and give more excuses for countries like China to keep blocking its full membership to the Nuclear Suppliers Group, or NSG. So, in conclusion, I mean, Rajnath Singh didn't say that India was actually changing its policy from like that day, but it could be revised in the future if the need arises to do so. Now, see, now no doctrine is ever set in stone forever, and they always change as per the circumstances of that era. All he was suggesting is that we cannot guarantee that the doctrine will hold for all times. Now, many have already called for a periodic review of the doctrine, and in India's case, there is no exception. Now, India's strategic environment has massively changed in the last 20 years or so since Pokhran 2, and is still constantly evolving, as we have seen over the events of the past 4 or 5 years, and especially the last 6 months. So, as mentioned, any change in the policy will require some cost to be borne by India, and some thinking to be done by the government and strategic decision makers. They will have to take all the points that we mentioned of switching from no first use to first use
Hmm.
policy. Now we know that Rajnath Singh, unlike many other politicians, is always measured in his comments and doesn't make like a lot of over the top statements. So he isn't signaling a shift from NFU today, but is keeping India's position open on the possibility of moving away in the future if the circumstances force it to be. This was probably to, like, I mean, send a message to Pakistan that, hey, it should not take like India's NFU as sacrosanct in perpetuity, while they continue to sponsor terrorist attacks against India via non-state actors, while they try to hide behind their nuclear umbrella. I mean, which has been the hiding behind the nuclear umbrella has been sort of hollowed out by the cross-border surgical strikes in 2016 and 19. But I
Right.
don't think it has stopped Pakistan from trying to push more terrorists into India to create more mayhem.
Exactly, and which is why each Indian response will have to be bigger than the previous response. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In conclusion, again, Mohal, the Modi government appears to have calculated that the fear of an Indian nuclear strike will raise Pakistan's costs of cross-border terrorism, thus deterring its use. But only time will tell if that kind of a calculation actually was correct or not. What is interesting amidst all this is that there has been no response coming in from India's other nuclear neighbor, China, which too has a stated no first use policy, and with which India has already fought a war more than half a century ago. The very fact that China did not react and Pakistan reacted the way it did helps the Modi government believe that the statement from Defense Minister has served its purpose of instilling some sort of confusion and lack of clarity in the mind of the adversary, and that, in the absence of a valid, updated nuclear doctrine, serves the purpose for now for the Modi government.
Yeah, I think, I mean, even if you look at Pakistan's behavior, I mean, every time they've been just threatening the uh, use of nuclear weapons. I mean, it's funny, like couple of days ago, they launched a nuclear ballistic, sorry, not the a nuclear short range missile. And the next day, Imran Khan is writing an op-ed in the New York Times saying that the world should be aware that a nuclear war could break out. So, like, it shows kind of the schizophrenic
Mm-hmm.
behavior from Pakistan, where on one hand they might threaten with nuclear weapons, and the other hand they would launch ballistic missiles from its to satisfy its domestic audience. I mean, but India has like shown, like with Balakot and like the cross-border strikes, that the overhang of the nuclear umbrella doesn't fear India, and it's ready to there is a space, subconventional space, to respond to terrorist attacks, which is well below the nuclear threshold.
Right. Okay. So, dear listeners, if you are listening to our episode for the first time, each episode we recommend to you any book, article, or any other read that we feel might interest you. Keeping the practice going, Mohal, what is your recommendation?
I would recommend the listeners to go like read any of Dr. Manpreet Sethi's books or papers or even recent articles post Rajnath Singh's comments.
Mhm.
I mean, she's one of the most well-researched scholars on the nuclear policy in India.
Absolutely, I concur with you.
So, Kishore, what's your recommendation for this week?
Yeah, so my recommendation for the week is actually the book written by Shiv Shankar Menon, ambassador himself, who after retiring wrote a book titled Choices Inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy, where he actually talks about all the decision-making choices that he either participated directly or was associated in. So they include the 2005 to 2008 U.S.-India nuclear agreement, the first ever boundary-related agreement between India and China, India's decision not to use overt force against Pakistan in response to the 2008 terror attacks in Mumbai, and also the 2009 defeat of the Tamil rebellion in Sri Lanka, and also India's disavowal of the first use of nuclear weapons. So that would be an interesting read, I believe. So that would be my recommendation for the week. So, that, dear listeners, wraps up today's episode, where we covered in detail the stated nuclear doctrine policy of the Indian government and the statement by the defense minister on how it is neither permanent nor bound to India's peaceful rise. To continue hearing about such interesting topics, do subscribe to our channel India Rising wherever you are listening to us. If you have not left us a review, we urge you to do so as it helps other listeners like you in finding us. We would also like to hear from you if you have any suggestions on any topics that you would like us to cover. Do remember that these topics should be directly related to Indian foreign policy. Until the next time, this is Mohal and Kishore signing off.